I think the discussion is over already because after all, Dr. Cornwell just said he just picked a definition he liked. So I guess the true definition is based on our liking it or not, which would kind of make it relative. But I see his larger point, okay, which is that it is difficult to think about what truth is. I think it's also difficult to think about what is absolute, okay, and clearly as I approach this question, it seems to me you help clarify the situation a little bit by pointing out that it kind of depends what we're talking about here. To say things are either absolute or relativist really is kind of posing to me the question in a strange way, because clearly some things are perhaps absolute and some things are relative. So it's just a question of what it is that we're talking about in a particular situation. Okay. Now, it's my job to argue that things are in fact relativist, and let me go back to thinking about the notion of truth. It seems to me we first all have to say truth is the object of knowledge. Okay, in other words, knowledge gives us access to the truth. If we don't have knowledge about something, we don't have a handle on the truth. So that's a fundamental requirement. And given that framework, we then have to say, what is it that gives us knowledge about something? And the modern debate in philosophy was started in regards to that by a guy called René Descartes, whom you might have heard of. And his claim was that the way we get truth is by having knowledge of it, and the way we get knowledge of something is by being certain about it. Okay, so that seems to me to be a fundamental requirement of access to truth, that you have to have certainty about it. And this is where I come in as a relativist then. Okay, I'm much too humble. I didn't get straight A's. And I lie a lot too. I'm much too humble to make the claim that I could be certain about anything. And again, in a way that's reflected in what you said. You know, you said we can define truth, but what that truth is, we've been arguing about for a long time. Much better minds than we have, and as a result, you know, I'm not sure about the truth. I'm more sure about some things than I am about other stuff. Okay. Secondly, I think we want to realize that this discussion really needs to be cut up into two dimensions when we're talking about the truth, okay? And from the philosophical perspective, I'll call those the factual and normative dimensions. Some truths we might be talking about, rock is a rock, that's what I would call a factual question, okay? Other truths is you should love your neighbor. That's not a factual question. That's a normative question that comes to us perhaps in the form of a command of some kind. And factual questions are fundamentally different from normative questions. Okay? So even if perhaps we agree that some facts are absolute, okay, and I'm not even sure about that, okay, then there can still be disagreement about what ought to be the case. which also some people consider part of the truth. Okay, so those are two different things. And finally, I want to call to mind for us a philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre, a 20th century existentialist, who argued in some ways pretty convincingly that there is no real raw data. There are no facts. Everything is subject to human interpretation. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with human interpretation, but we have to recognize our own limitations in terms of what we are able to accomplish. And back to the humbleness point, okay, we want to be careful that we don't exceed our grasp in this regard, that we don't think, as Socrates would say, that we know more than we do.
All right, we're going to get into some more situational questions.
Can I answer the last part?
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry if I got the last part of the question, which was, what effect do you think, and I'll make this short, what effect do you think this has on everyday life? And my answer is basically none. Most people don't worry about the big underlying logical framework of things. We all tend to believe what we believe. I'm no different from anybody else. And when a famous philosopher called David Hume, who's a skeptic, argued that we really couldn't know anything. Some guy came along and said, why don't you go ahead and kick this rock, okay, and see how you feel about that, okay? And the point was, of course, that, you know, on an abstract, theoretical level, Hume said we couldn't know there was a rock there, but it sure as heck hurt him when he kicked it.
Thank you. Dr. Luegenbiehl, as you said, there are a lot of different aspects to the truth question, and so you kind of have to get into specific situations and see how each thought group or each thought system would apply in that. So we're going to get into that. Dr. Cornwell, how would you say that humans can have an absolute truth if all of our society constructs and our time period and culture are just so subjective and relative to ourselves?
Okay. Again, I don't like the question, so I rewrote it. I also want to agree with Heinz in that I agree there's not an absolute definition of absolute truth. So that I'm not denying that there's relative truth. I'm just saying there is absolute truth. And so, again, I don't think the question is how do we have absolute truth. I think the better question is how do we know absolute truth. And if there's no God, then I'm not sure there is a basis for saying we know absolute truth, whether it's Hume or Nietzsche or whoever. A lot of philosophers have discussed that. But I think that if there is a God, then we do have a basis for knowing that there is absolute truth. We have to be very careful of defining what is that absolute truth. I think we can make it much narrower, much broader than it perhaps actually is. So I think there's certainly a lot of statement in saying that we have a lot of constructs that are based on our society, based on our time, based on our culture. I don't disagree with that. In fact, much of what we know is relative and subjective. If there was a crash at an intersection and you had one person at each corner and observing, and you ask them what happened, they all would have a different perspective. Do any of them know the truth about that impact? And I would say probably not. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a truth about the impact. In other words, if you had lots of cameras and they could identify exactly how each car, which one hit first and which one ran the stops, yeah, I think you could do it if you had enough as far as the objective fact of the impact, but you still couldn't get to the motivations behind the people driving it, even from that sort of data. But I think if you were outside, if you were God, if you had all knowledge, then I think you could look at the objective truth of that particular event. So again, I think in general, we can't decide if something's absolute truth based on culture, based on emotion, because I think you could have two people saying, you know, I was a wife beater and an alcoholic, and I became a Buddhist, and it changed my life, and I'm now kind and loving. I know that's true. And you have a Christian who says, I was a wife beater and an alcoholic, and I became a Christian, and Jesus changed my life, and I know that's true. I think you could